The autumn air was crisp when Martha Stewart stepped out of her car and walked slowly across the parking lot of the small-town gun store. The sky above was pale blue, brushed with thin clouds that drifted lazily. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and held her purse close. Her steps were steady, but anyone who looked carefully could see the small hesitation in her gait, the way she measured each movement as if she carried more than just years with her. Martha was 72. She had lived through changes that most of the young people in town couldn't imagine. She had raised children, lost her husband, worked jobs that demanded patience, and given her heart to a life that was full of both joy and hardship. Her farmhouse, the one she still lived in, stood on a quiet road outside of town. It was peaceful most of the time, but lately she had felt uneasy. Nights seemed darker than before. She had seen strangers drive slowly past her property. A few times, coyotes had come too close to her porch. She had thought about it for months whether it was time to get a small handgun. Not because she wanted to use it, but because she wanted to feel secure. She wanted to sleep at night knowing she had something to protect herself with if she ever needed it. Martha had never been in a gun store before. Her late husband, Robert, had been the one who handled things like that. He had been a kind man, gentle with his words, but strong when life demanded it. He had taught their children to be respectful and brave. When he passed away 6 years ago, Martha had learned how quiet a house could become. The sound of the clock ticking, the creak of the wooden floor, even the wind outside, it all felt louder when no one else was there. She reached for the glass door of the shop and pulled it open. The bell above rang out, sharp and metallic. Inside, the store smelled faintly of oil and leather. The walls were lined with rifles, and the glass counters displayed handguns, neatly arranged. Fluorescent lights glared overhead, giving the room a bright but cold feeling. There were 4 people inside. 2 young men stood near the counter, leaning against the glass case, whispering and laughing. The clerk, a man in his 30s, stood behind the counter cleaning a handgun with a cloth. Another customer, older, was at the far end looking at hunting rifles. As Martha stepped in, the young men noticed her. Their eyes widened, then narrowed. One of them nudged the other, and soon they were whispering again, louder this time. "Look at this," one said with a grin. "Grandma's here for a pistol." The other chuckled. "Maybe she's trying to re-enlist. Civil War's calling." They both laughed. Their laughter wasn't cruel in the sharpest way, but it was careless, the kind that stung because it dismissed her completely. Martha pretended not to hear. She kept her head high, her silver hair tied back neatly, and walked to the counter. Her heart was beating faster than usual, but she wouldn't let them see. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. "I'd like to see something simple. A handgun I can manage." The clerk glanced up. He looked her over quickly, his mouth twitching as if he wanted to laugh too. "Ma'am, these aren't knitting needles. Are you sure you know what you're asking for?" The young men burst out laughing again. One of them repeated the word simple in a mock high-pitched tone, dragging it out. "I'd like something simple," he mimicked, pretending to wobble on his feet as if he might trip. Martha stood quietly. Her hands folded neatly over her purse. She didn't argue. She didn't respond. But inside, her heart ached. She remembered nights when she had stayed awake tending to her children's fevers, mornings when she had worked 2 jobs to help Robert keep the family steady, years of patience, years of strength. She had given so much of herself to life, and now she was reduced to a joke in a small town store. The older customer at the far end glanced at her, then looked away, unwilling to step in. The clerk shook his head and muttered, "Maybe you should just go home, ma'am. These things aren't for everyone." For a moment, Martha thought about turning around and leaving. The sting in her chest was heavy. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was foolish for someone her age to even think about buying a gun. She had never been reckless in her life, she didn't want to start now. But just as she shifted her purse on her shoulder and prepared to step back, the door of the store swung open. The bell clanged again, louder this time. Everyone turned. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. His presence seemed to fill the room immediately. He walked with purpose, his shoulders squared, his steps confident. He was not from the town, that was clear at first glance. The young men's laughter faded. The clerk straightened his back. Even the older customer paused, recognizing the face. It was Jeff Bezos. No one expected to see him in their quiet town. He had been in the region for a project, people had heard, but no one imagined he would walk into this small store on a quiet afternoon. His face was familiar from news, from magazines, from television. Jeff looked around, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He didn't stop at the clerk. He didn't stop at the young men. His gaze went straight to Martha, who stood near the counter, her cheeks still flushed from embarrassment. He paused, studying her for just a moment. Then he walked directly toward her. The room went silent. Jeff stopped beside her, ignoring the clerk and the young men as though they didn't exist. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, steady, and full of respect. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, giving her a small nod. His tone carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it was sincere. "May I ask what you're looking for today?" Martha blinked, surprised. She had not expected anyone, let alone him, to notice her, let alone address her with such respect. For the first time that day, a small smile formed on her lips. "I was hoping for something simple," she said softly, repeating her earlier words but with a little more strength now. "Something I can manage." Jeff looked at her, then glanced at the clerk. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried a sharpness that made the clerk swallow nervously. "I think," Jeff said slowly, "the lady deserves to see the best options you have." The young men shifted uncomfortably. The smirks on their faces had disappeared. Martha stood a little straighter. The sting in her heart eased, replaced by a quiet warmth. For the first time that afternoon, she felt seen, not as a joke, not as someone fragile, but as a person worthy of respect. The bell above the door was still swaying slightly, but the room was completely silent. For Martha, the moment felt like the beginning of something she hadn't felt in years, a reminder that her voice still mattered, that she still had dignity, and that sometimes, kindness could arrive in the most unexpected ways. The silence inside the gun store hung heavy after Jeff Bezos's words. The two young men who had been laughing earlier no longer dared to make a sound. The clerk, who just moments ago had mocked Martha, now shifted nervously behind the counter. His face reddened as he fumbled with the cloth in his hand. Martha stood quietly, her purse still hanging from her arm. She felt the weight of every eye on her, but for the first time, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. Jeff's presence, calm but commanding, had changed everything. The clerk finally cleared his throat. "Of course, sir," he muttered. "Yes, absolutely. Let me show the lady some options." Jeff gave Martha a small nod, as if to assure her that this moment was hers. Then he stepped slightly to the side but stayed close, his tall frame like a silent shield between her and the young men. The clerk unlocked the glass case and carefully lifted out a small revolver. His tone was different now, measured, polite. This is a .38 special. Light recoil, simple to use. Many people prefer it for personal protection. Martha leaned forward slightly, her hands still steady despite her years. She studied the gun with quiet curiosity. She wasn't afraid of it. She wasn't thrilled either. To her, it wasn't a symbol of power or fear, it was simply a tool, something practical. "May I hold it?" she asked. The clerk hesitated, then nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am, of course." He placed it carefully in her hands. The metal was cool and heavier than she expected. Martha turned it gently, feeling the balance. She didn't lift it high, only enough to sense its weight. Her hands, though older, didn't tremble. She had baked bread, sewed clothes, mended fences, and lifted grandchildren into her arms. Her strength had never been loud, but it had always been steady. The young men watched quietly now, no laughter in their eyes. For the first time, they noticed that the woman they had mocked just minutes ago carried herself with a grace they did not understand. Jeff's voice broke the silence. "It suits you," he said softly. Martha glanced at him, a little surprised by the kindness in his tone. She gave a small smile, then set the revolver back on the counter. "It's heavier than I thought. But it feels honest. Not complicated?" The clerk nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. It's very reliable. We also have semi-automatics that are light and easy to use, if you'd like to see those." Martha shook her head gently. "One thing at a time." Jeff chuckled quietly, not in mockery but in respect. "That's wisdom speaking," he said. The clerk hurried to show her another option, a smaller handgun, sleek and light. Martha examined it carefully but spoke little. She didn't want to be rushed. While she studied, Jeff turned to the young men, his eyes sharp but calm. "You know," he said quietly, "respect costs nothing. But the lack of it," he paused, letting the weight of his words settle, "it can cost you everything." The young men looked down at their shoes. Neither spoke. Martha didn't turn toward them, but she heard every word. Something inside her, something that had been bruised, began to heal. After a few minutes, Martha handed the second gun back to the clerk. "Thank you," she said softly. "I think I'll need time to decide. I don't rush into important things." The clerk nodded quickly, eager to please. "Of course, ma'am. Take all the time you need. If you have questions, I'll be glad to answer." Martha gave him a polite smile, then stepped back slightly, her eyes moving to Jeff. "Thank you," she said to him, her voice low but filled with sincerity. Jeff shook his head. "You don't owe me thanks. You deserve respect, ma'am. Always." The older customer who had been watching from the far end finally spoke. His voice was slow, thoughtful. "She carries herself better than most people who walk through that door. Shame on us for not noticing sooner." Martha looked at him, surprised. The man gave her a small nod, his weathered face serious. The moment felt bigger than the small store. It wasn't about guns anymore. It was about dignity, about the quiet strength of a woman who had lived through decades and still stood with her head high. Jeff glanced at his watch, then looked back at Martha. "Would you allow me to walk you out?" he asked gently. Martha hesitated, unused to such courtesy, but then nodded. "Yes, thank you." The clerk quickly placed the revolver back in the case, locking it with care. The young men remained silent, their earlier boldness gone. As Martha walked toward the door, Jeff walked beside her. The bell above rang again when he pushed the door open for her. The cool air of the afternoon rushed in, brushing her cheeks with a freshness that felt almost like freedom. They stepped outside. The parking lot was quiet, just a few cars parked under the pale autumn sky. Martha stopped near her old sedan, turning to face him. "I'm not used to people standing up for me," she admitted. Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened slightly. Jeff smiled softly. "You shouldn't have to fight for respect. It should already be there. But sometimes the world needs reminding." Martha studied him for a moment. She had seen his face on television, heard his name in the news, but here he wasn't the billionaire everyone talked about. He was simply a man who had chosen kindness over silence. "I only wanted to feel safe," she said quietly. "But walking in there, I felt smaller than I ever have." Jeff shook his head firmly. "You're not small. You carry more history in your life than most people can imagine. That deserves to be honored." For a long moment, they stood quietly in the cool air. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves across the pavement. Martha finally gave a soft laugh, though it carried no bitterness. "Robert, my husband, used to tell me that respect is the one gift you can give to anyone, rich or poor. He believed it more than anything." Jeff nodded. "Your husband was a wise man." She looked down at her hands, folded on her purse. "I miss him every day. He would have known how to handle that moment in there. Me, I just wanted to leave." Jeff's voice was steady. "Sometimes silence is its own kind of strength. But sometimes speaking up matters too. I only did what anyone should do." Martha looked up at him, her eyes clear now. "Not everyone would. That's the truth." The parking lot grew quiet again, the distant hum of a truck on the highway the only sound. Finally, Martha unlocked her car door. "Thank you again, Mr. Bezos." Jeff smiled faintly. "Just Jeff is fine." She nodded, slipping into the driver's seat. "Just Martha, then." He chuckled softly. "Just Martha." She started the engine, the old car rumbling to life. Before pulling away, she looked at him once more. "You made today easier than it could have been. I won't forget that." Jeff stepped back, giving her space. "And I won't forget you, Martha. Drive safe." As she pulled out of the lot, the young men inside the store watched from the window. Something about the way she drove away, the calm strength in her shoulders, the quiet dignity in her presence, made them realize they had laughed at the wrong person. Inside her car, Martha gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. For the first time in weeks, she felt lighter. Not because she had bought a gun she hadn't, but because she had been reminded of something far more powerful: her worth. Martha Stewart drove slowly down the country road, her old sedan humming against the autumn breeze. The quiet fields stretched on either side, golden with tall grass. She had always loved this drive, the way the horizon opened wide, the way the sky seemed endless. But that afternoon, something inside her felt different. Her hands rested firmly on the steering wheel. Her heart, which had been heavy when she walked into the gun store, now carried a quiet strength. She thought of Jeff's words, the way he had looked at her, not as someone fragile, not as a burden, but as a person worthy of respect. When she reached her farmhouse, she parked near the porch. The wooden steps creaked as she climbed them. The house stood steady, weathered by years but strong, much like her. She paused for a moment before unlocking the door, gazing at the fields that stretched behind the barn. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She remembered Robert often saying, "The sunset doesn't ask if you're ready. It just happens. All you can do is notice it." She whispered to herself, "I noticed today." Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets she kept in her drawers. It was quiet, too quiet sometimes. She hung her cardigan, placed her purse on the table, and sat by the window. Her mind returned to the store, to the laughter of the young men, the clerk's mocking tone, and then to the silence that followed Jeff's voice. She had not realized how much she needed that moment. It was not about the gun anymore. It was about remembering that her presence still mattered. That night, Martha prepared a simple dinner: vegetable soup and a slice of bread. She ate slowly, her thoughts deep. Afterward, she wrote in her journal, something she had done for years. Her pen moved across the page in neat handwriting. "Today, I was reminded that age is not weakness. It is history, carried in the heart. Someone stood up for me. I felt strong again." She closed the book gently, placing it on the table beside her lamp. For the first time in weeks, she slept peacefully. The next morning, the air was brisk and cool. Martha woke early, just as she always had. She made her tea and stepped outside onto the porch. The fields glistened with dew, and birds called from the trees. But as she sipped her tea, a sound in the distance made her pause. Tires on gravel. She turned her head toward the long driveway leading to her house. A sleek black car rolled slowly forward. Her heart tightened for a moment. She wasn't used to visitors. The car came to a stop, and the driver's door opened. To her surprise, it was Jeff Bezos, stepping out in a casual jacket and slacks. He didn't look like the powerful figure from news articles. He looked simply like a man who had chosen to stop by. "Martha," he called gently, lifting a hand in greeting. She blinked, startled but not unkindly. "Mr. Bezos." He smiled. "Jeff, please. I hope I'm not intruding." Martha set her teacup down. "Not at all. But what brings you all the way out here?" He walked up the porch steps, careful, respectful. "I was driving through. Thought I might check on you. Yesterday didn't sit right with me. I wanted to make sure you were all right." Martha tilted her head, studying him. Few people took the time to care. Most people were too busy, too caught up in their own lives. His visit felt unusual, but not unwelcome. "I'm fine," she said softly. "Better than I was before I walked into that store. You gave me something I didn't know I'd lost." Jeff leaned against the porch railing, his eyes scanning the wide fields. "Respect." "Hope," Martha corrected. "That my voice still matters. That people can still see me." Jeff nodded slowly. "You've lived a long life. That's not something to dismiss. That's something to honor." Martha smiled faintly. "You talk like Robert used to." "Your husband?" She nodded. "He always said the world forgets too quickly. But kindness, when you give it, it lasts longer than you think." Jeff was quiet for a moment, then said, he was right. They sat together on the porch, the morning sun rising higher. The air carried the scent of earth and grass. For Martha, it felt almost like Robert was there too, listening in silence. Later that day, Martha went into town to buy groceries. The same two young men from the gun store happened to be at the market. She noticed them near the produce section. At first, they avoided her gaze. But then, one of them, tall with sandy hair, stepped forward. His voice was awkward, but sincere. "Ma'am," he said, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for yesterday." The other, shifting nervously, added, "We shouldn't have left. It wasn't right." Martha studied them carefully. Their words weren't polished, but their eyes showed something real. Regret. She gave a small nod. "Thank you for saying that. I hope you remember, one day, that age doesn't erase worth. It adds to it." The young men nodded quickly, then stepped back, their faces red but earnest. Martha walked away with her basket, her steps light. Forgiveness wasn't always easy, but it carried its own strength. That evening, Martha sat on her porch again. The sun dipped low, setting the fields aglow. She thought about the day, the apology from the young men, Jeff's unexpected visit, the quiet peace she felt inside. She realized something important: the laughter in the store had tried to take her dignity, but kindness had returned it. Her life wasn't about being forgotten. It was about being remembered in the small, honest ways that mattered. She whispered into the evening air, as though Robert could still hear, "I am still here. And I am still strong." The wind carried her words softly across the fields. And for the first time in years, Martha didn't feel alone. The days after the gun store incident passed quietly, yet something inside Martha had changed. Her farmhouse felt the same: the wooden steps still creaked, the kettle still whistled each morning, and the wind still whistled through the trees, but her heart no longer carried the same heaviness. She thought often about Jeff's visit. The way he had shown up on her porch, unannounced, just to check on her. It reminded her of the kind of kindness people rarely took time for anymore. She also thought of the young men at the market, awkwardly apologizing. Their words had been simple, but sincerity had shown through. For Martha, these moments mattered. They told her that her life still reached into the lives of others, that even in her 70s she could still change the way people thought, simply by standing with dignity. One cool Friday afternoon, Martha decided to bake. She dusted her counter with flour, rolled dough carefully with steady hands, and filled her kitchen with the warm smell of bread. Baking had always been her comfort. It reminded her of the years when her children were young, running through the kitchen, leaving muddy footprints across the floor, laughing as they waited for fresh bread to cool. She wrapped 2 loaves in cloth when they were done. One she kept for herself, and the other she carried to her neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, a widow like her who lived a mile down the road. The walk was slow but pleasant, the golden fields glowing in the afternoon sun. Mrs. Johnson greeted her warmly. "Martha, you spoil me with this bread." "It's nothing," Martha smiled. "I just thought you might like something warm for supper." As they sat for tea, Martha shared what had happened at the store. Mrs. Johnson listened closely, her eyes wide, her hands clasped. "They laughed at you?" she asked, shaking her head. "At you of all people?" Martha gave a small shrug. "People forget that gray hair carries stories. And Jeff Bezos himself stood up for you," Mrs. Johnson said with surprise. Martha nodded. "Yes. And more than that, he treated me as if I mattered. That's what stayed with me." Mrs. Johnson leaned back in her chair, smiling faintly. "Well, it's about time the world remembered who Martha Stewart really is." Martha chuckled softly. "I'm just a woman trying to live her days in peace." Mrs. Johnson shook her head. "No, you're more than that. You've lived through losses and joys, raised a family, and still stand with kindness. That is no small thing. Martha carried those words with her on the walk home. The following week, Jeff returned to town for meetings about his project. But before leaving again, he stopped by Martha's farmhouse once more. He found her in the garden, pulling weeds near her rose bushes. "Martha," he called. She looked up, shading her eyes with her hand. "Jeff. You caught me in the middle of my work." He smiled. "Hard work looks good on you." She laughed gently. "That's because it's all I know." Jeff walked over, crouching down beside her. "I wanted to thank you. You've been on my mind since the store. That day, you reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and graceful." Martha set down her gloves. "Strength doesn't disappear with age, Jeff. It just changes shape. People forget that." He nodded slowly. "You're right. And I think the whole town saw it that day, even if they didn't say it out loud." Martha smiled. "Respect spreads, if you give it room to grow." They spoke for nearly an hour, sitting by the roses, sharing stories. Martha told him about Robert, about raising children, about the challenges of living simply. Jeff shared pieces of his journey too, the struggles no one usually talked about, the weight of responsibility, the loneliness that often came with success. When he left, Martha felt lighter. She realized something important: even people the world considered powerful sometimes needed reminding of the basics: kindness, respect, and quiet strength. A few days later, Martha went back to town. She needed supplies from the store, and though she hadn't planned to, she found herself walking past the same gun shop. The bell over the door jingled as she entered. The same clerk was there, but his manner had changed. His face lit up when he saw her. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said politely. Martha nodded, her expression calm. The two young men who had mocked her before were also inside, looking at hunting rifles. They froze when they saw her, guilt flashing across their faces. One of them stepped forward cautiously. "Ma'am," he said, "we meant what we said before. We're really sorry. We were wrong." The other added, "We didn't see it then, but you carry yourself with more strength than most of us. We should have respected that." Martha studied them quietly. Their voices trembled a little, but their eyes were sincere. She gave them a small smile. "Respect is like a seed," she said softly. "When you plant it, it grows. You've planted yours now. Let it grow into the kind of men you want to be." The young men nodded, relief spreading across their faces. The clerk, still red-faced from shame, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology too. I didn't treat you right that day. It won't happen again." Martha inclined her head gently. "Thank you. That means more than you think." She didn't stay long. She hadn't come to buy anything, only to see if her heart would tremble when she walked inside again. It didn't. She felt steady, calm, at peace. As she stepped back into the sunlight, she realized she had won something greater than any object inside the store. She had won back her dignity, and she had taught others the value of respect. That evening, Martha wrote again in her journal. The young men apologized. The clerk too. "I did not ask for it, but it came. I see now that kindness does not end with one moment, it ripples. Jeff's respect gave me strength, and that strength reached others. I am grateful." She closed the journal, placed it by her lamp, and looked out the window. The moon hung low, silver against the dark sky. Martha whispered softly, as though Robert could hear, "You were right. Kindness does last longer than we think." The farmhouse was quiet, but her heart was full. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected began to happen. People in town started greeting her differently. At the market, at the post office, even at church, neighbors who once overlooked her now called her ma'am with genuine respect. It wasn't forced. It was real. The story of the gun store had spread, not in detail, but in spirit. People spoke about how Jeff Bezos had stood beside her, but more importantly, how Martha had stood tall through it all. One Sunday after service, the pastor shook her hand warmly. "Martha, your quiet strength has been a lesson to many. You've reminded us all of something we had forgotten." Martha smiled gently, her eyes shining. "It wasn't me alone. Respect grows when it is shared." The pastor nodded. "Still, you were the spark." Martha walked home that day with the autumn wind brushing against her face. She didn't need to carry the weight of loneliness anymore. The world had seen her, and in return, she had reminded the world of something it needed to see. She wasn't just an old woman at a counter. She was Martha Stewart, and her life still carried meaning, strength, and dignity. And for the first time in a long time, she believed that the best chapters of her story might not be behind her but still ahead. The crisp air of late autumn drifted across Martha's farmhouse. Golden leaves scattered along the ground, the trees slowly giving up their colors as winter prepared to arrive. Martha stood by her window one morning, sipping tea from her old china cup. Life had slowed into a steady rhythm again, but it felt different now. Ever since the day at the gun store, people in town had begun to treat her with new respect. Strangers tipped their hats, neighbors stopped to ask how she was doing, and even children whispered her name with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Martha never asked for it, but she accepted it quietly, with the same dignity that had carried her through the hardest years of her life. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt seen. One Saturday, the town held a harvest fair at the square. The fair was simple handmade crafts, roasted corn, and a small band playing cheerful tunes. Martha decided to attend, wrapping herself in a warm shawl. She carried a basket of her fresh bread, thinking she might share it with anyone who looked like they needed a smile. As she walked among the stalls, she noticed how people looked at her now. Not with pity, not with dismissal, but with genuine warmth. Some stopped to greet her. Others simply nodded with respect. "Martha, your bread is the best," one farmer's wife said, taking a loaf. Another neighbor whispered, "You're the lady who taught us what real strength looks like." Martha only smiled gently. She did not think of herself as someone special, only as a woman who had kept walking when life was heavy. As the afternoon sun lowered, she found a bench and sat for a while, listening to the laughter of children playing nearby. It filled her with peace. Not long after, Jeff Bezos returned to town again. His project had begun to take shape, and he had grown fond of visiting the countryside during his trips. Word spread quickly through the town square that he had arrived. When Jeff spotted Martha sitting quietly on the bench, he walked over at once. "Martha," he greeted warmly. She looked up, her face brightening. "Jeff. I thought you'd be too busy to come to such a small fair." "Some things are more important than meetings," he said with a smile. "I wanted to see you." Martha chuckled. "And here I thought I was just another old woman in a shawl." "No," Jeff replied firmly. "You're a reminder of what matters." They sat together for a while, sharing roasted corn and listening to the band. People glanced their way, whispering about the unusual friendship between the world's richest man and the town's quiet widow. But Martha paid no attention. She simply enjoyed the company. As evening approached, Jeff turned to her. "Martha, I've been thinking. You've shown me something I had forgotten: the value of respect, the strength of simple kindness. I want others to learn from you too." Martha tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I'd like to support you in sharing your wisdom," Jeff said. "Maybe a book, or talks, or even a small foundation in your name. Something that carries your lessons forward." Martha's eyes widened. She had never thought of herself as someone whose words would reach beyond her little town. She was just Martha, mother, widow, baker of bread, caretaker of roses. She shook her head gently. "Jeff, I don't need my name in lights. That was never my way." Jeff nodded, thoughtful. "I understand. But maybe your words could light the path for others who feel forgotten." Martha was quiet for a long moment. The idea both frightened and humbled her. Finally, she said, "If it helps others remember to carry respect in their hearts, then yes. But let it be simple, like my life. Nothing grand, just true." Jeff smiled. "Then that's what it will be." The next weeks passed with surprising changes. With Jeff's help, Martha began writing down the lessons she had carried all her life. She filled pages with stories of her youth, her marriage, the years of raising children, the hardships and the joys. She wrote about Robert's steady hand, about the kindness of neighbors, about the dignity of keeping one's head high even in the face of dismissal. Her words were plain and simple, yet powerful. They carried the weight of truth. Jeff arranged for them to be published in a small book called The Quiet Strength. The cover was simple, no flashy design, just her name and a soft image of her farmhouse under the evening sky. When the book came out, people across the country began reading it. Letters arrived at Martha's farmhouse from strangers who said her words had given them hope, reminding them that even in old age, life still carried meaning. Martha read those letters with tears in her eyes. She had never imagined her quiet life could touch people she had never met. Back in town, something even more beautiful began to happen. Inspired by Martha's story, the community started treating all elders differently. At the market, people offered seats to older shoppers. At church, young men walked elderly women to their cars. At school, teachers began speaking to children about the importance of respecting their grandparents. It was as though Martha's dignity had planted seeds in every heart, and now they were blooming. One winter evening, the town council surprised Martha by inviting her to the community hall. She thought it was just another small gathering, but when she entered, the room was filled with people. Neighbors, friends, children, and even the pastor stood waiting. A banner hung across the hall: "Thank you, Martha Stewart, for reminding us of respect." Tears welled in Martha's eyes as applause filled the room. She had never been honored in such a way. She stood there, overwhelmed, before finally speaking. "I am not special," she said softly. "I am only a woman who lived her days as best as she could. But if my life has taught anything, let it be this: respect is not a gift you give to the strong, or the young, or the powerful alone. Respect belongs to everyone. And when you give it, you make the world kinder, one small act at a time." The hall grew silent, then burst into applause again. Jeff, standing near the front, wiped his eyes quietly. That night, when Martha returned home, she sat by her window once more. The stars were bright above, and the farmhouse was warm with the smell of her evening tea. She opened her journal and wrote, "I thought my best days had passed. I thought I was invisible. But I see now that life is not measured by age. It is measured by the light we leave behind. And as long as kindness is remembered, none of us ever truly fade." She closed the journal, placed it on the table, and looked out at the fields that had carried her through so many seasons. The world outside was quiet, but her heart was alive with peace. She no longer felt alone. She no longer wondered if she mattered. She had left her mark, not through wealth or fame, but through the quiet strength she had carried all her life. Years later, long after Martha had gone, her farmhouse still stood, and roses still bloomed by the porch. People told stories about her, about the day she faced disrespect with calm, about the kindness she spread with her bread, about the wisdom she left in her little book. Children grew up hearing her name spoken with love. Travelers who passed through town sometimes stopped to see the farmhouse where the woman of quiet strength had lived. And every autumn, at the harvest fair, people gathered to celebrate not just the season, but the values she had reminded them to hold close. Martha had become more than a widow on a farm. She had become a light that guided others long after her own evening had passed. And in the hearts of all who remembered her, she lived on strong, kind, and quietly eternal.